Let your mind
Greetings, Paper Demons! Welcome to the monthly free art class live stream. I am excited to be here to teach another art lesson today. Actually, today's lesson is all about drawing immersive backgrounds, and this was requested by KM Kala, who's also in the chat. Hi, how you doing? Glad you could make it to this stream. So today we're going to go over how to create better backgrounds. Kim Kala had mentioned that when they're working on artwork, they'll work on their character and then kind of haphazardly add a background at the end. And this class is exactly for you to help you think about your backgrounds right from the start and get good results. So I'm going to cover several different techniques. If you've heard the term composition, we're going to talk a lot about that today. I'm going to teach you about the fundamentals with composition, some various tricks for that. I'm also going to cover, hey Strange Snake, welcome. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Also, hi Duskfire, how you doing? So today we're going to cover those topics. Let's see. Let's get started here. Who is this class for? So if you're wondering if this class is for you, this is for those who don't really think about their background until the end. This will teach you how to do it from the beginning and consider that background. And for those who want better backgrounds for their art, this class is for you. So who am I? Who's this person talking to all of you? My name is Bogus Red on the internets, but my real name is Susie Sahim. I'm founder of PaperDemon.com. It's an art and writing community. I am a former Google Doodler, which means my art has been seen by millions of people across the web. I'm also lead artist for the PaperDemon Art RPG. Okay, what are we going to cover today? So we are going to cover, first we're going to talk about some terminology, because there's going to be some terms I'm going to be using in this class that you will need to know, some common art terms. So I'm going to cover those definitions first. Then I'm going to cover ways to create focal points. Now, if you don't know what focal points are, I will explain it to you, don't worry. And also ways to arrange items onto your canvas or your art piece, which is basically another way of saying composition. And then we're going to do a live demo. We're going to go over a prompt and we're going to try using these techniques in real time. You can see my thought process and how I sketch out sketch using these different techniques. Okay, and well, of course we're going to do Q&A, so we can do a Q&A while we're doing that demo. So you're also welcome to ask me questions during, especially if it's a question related to what I'm talking about. I'll answer it right away. If it's a question that's kind of a little bit not what I'm talking about, it's best if we save it to the end for the Q&A section. Okay, so what are some terminology? So first I want to talk about thumbnailing. Now, if you attended the last class, you already know what this is. But just in case you didn't have a chance to join the last one, thumbnailing is a technique in which you draw little sketches that are really small, mostly for yourself, just to kind of play around with different ideas, different compositions, different layouts for your drawing. And these are, if you're working traditionally, like if you're drawing with pencil and paper, this will be, they'll only be like maybe an inch or 2 inches in size. So they're very, very small. That's why they're called thumbnails. And you're not really supposed to spend that much time on them, like maybe 3 minutes max. After that, if you're spending more time than that, you're probably moving into more of a sketch territory. Another thing that we're going to, another term that we're going to use, we're going to talk about value or tone. If I say, I'm probably going to use tone more, but when I say tone, I really mean value. So there's different, anytime you're talking about a color swatch, any particular color that's appearing in a work of art, it has different properties. It has a hue, it has a value, and it has a saturation. So what do these different things mean? So hue is referring to like what color of the rainbow is it from? Is it more red? Is it more orange? Is it more green? Saturation is referring to how much of the hue is actually in there. If there's no hue in there, it's going to be a gray. Whereas the more of that hue you add in there, it increases in saturation. Okay? So low saturation would be like a grayish color. Full saturation, it would be very, very bright. And value, which is the main term I want you to understand, is having to do with how light or how dark something is. So if it's really, really light in value, it'll be up here. If it's really dark in value, it'll be down here. So these are 3 different terms that you'll hear artists use. And if you attended the last class, you'll remember I talked about something called a tonal study, and I showed these examples. And that's where we're figuring out what the value or the tones are for the overall piece. That's going to come into play later in the lesson as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Okay, focal point. I mentioned this in the beginning. What is a focal point? So a focal point is a center of interest or activity of the piece. So this is something that you want to think about at the very beginning of when you're designing an art piece. It's like, where do you want the eye to go? Now you can have more than one focal point. You know, if we look at this artwork as an example, you know, the eye is kind of drawn to this area up here, you know, the magic that's being cast. And it's also being guided down here and then to the face and then kind of back up again to this character here. So there's multiple focal points in this art piece. But your art piece doesn't have to have multiple. It can have just one, it could have a couple. But this is something we're going to talk about as focal point. And what that means is where you want the eye to go. What's the main beats or areas of the piece that you want your viewer's eye to look at. Okay, composition. Here's another art term. This is the arrangement of elements within a work of art. We're going to use this term a lot because composition is really important when you're thinking about your backgrounds. Okay, so first we're going to, now that we've gotten some terms out of the way, now we're going to talk about ways to create focal points. And then after that, I'm going to get into a bunch of like really easy compositional techniques you can use. Okay, so what are some ways you can create focal points? Well, one is by using lighting or value or tone. And so you can use value to create areas like hot spots. Like if you've got a piece like this one in the upper left here that's mostly dark, and then you have spots that are like really bright, like really lit up, the eye is going to go there. So that's one way that you can draw the eye to where you want it to go. You can see I kind of did the similar thing here. And with this piece that we were just looking at with focal points, mostly the eye is being guided by where these like really bright magical spots are, right? Faces also tend to be automatically focal points oftentimes because we are humans and we like faces, and faces, if we can see them, they kind of become a focal point. And one of my art instructors, John Clapp, used to say, contrast is the meaning of life. I think that's a good way to remember this technique of using contrast, using light to help guide the eye. Oh, did we skip one? No, there we go. Okay, lines. You can also use lines and shapes to guide the eye. So for example, this is a sketch of an illustration I had started at one point where I've got radial lines kind of coming into the center of this book here. And so when you have radial lines like this, that creates an automatic focal point. Of course, this character's face is also a focal point because, as I just kind of talked about, a face is automatically going to be a focal point if it's visible. Another thing is you can use like rhythmic lines. So in this piece here, we've got this like really rhythmic set of lines in the lower left, this piece. We've got really rhythmic lines that are kind of guiding the eye to this focal point where the hand is casting magic. And that kind of guides the eye through the art piece, up and around, going in circles. Basically, your eye goes through this piece. Another thing is shapes. So if we look at this one on the right, we've got these kind of icicles shooting from the lower left that are basically pointing like a big beacon to this main focal point here, right? So they are almost like acting like arrows to point to this area. Okay, color and saturation. So if you have an area of your art piece that is higher in saturation, so saturation means like it's a really bright color, it doesn't have gray in it, it's like really, really bright. That is also a way to kind of guide the eye. So I kind of use that in this piece of my parents-in-law, their dog Bella. She's super cute. Unfortunately, she passed away last year, but I made this card as a gift for one of them. And I used red because I thought it would, stand out, create a nice focal point to guide the eye here. I think if I had a better example, though, of this, I'm using a lot of red through the whole piece, so not just on the main focal point. But in order to, really illustrate this point, if I was trying to illustrate the point of using color and saturation to guide the eye to a focal point, I would just use that bright color right in that main focal point rather than throughout the whole piece, if that makes sense. Okay, creating depth. So we've covered focal points and some different ways that you can guide the eye to that focal point. Now let's talk about how you can have more depth in your art piece. So, when you are doing your thumbnailing or your sketching of your art piece, you want to think about your background in 3 planes. You don't have to use 3 all the time. You can use less than that or more, but the more planes you have, the more sense of depth your art piece will have. So, foreground, middle ground, background. Typically, your focal point is probably going to be in the middle ground, but not necessarily. Depends on the piece that you're constructing. And another trick to help you create this depth is to use a certain range of tones within these 3 planes. So your 3 planes, foreground, middle ground, background. I have a typo here. There shouldn't be a space there. If you use dark tones in your foreground, mid-tones in your middle ground, and light tones in your background, you've got a pretty good structure there. So we have a question from Strange Snake. So it's best to place lighter, brighter areas in the front instead of the back. So in this case, we're actually doing the darks in the foreground and the midtones in the middle ground. You don't have to use a structure, but this structure is a commonly used one that works. You could do the reverse, like if it's something that's like a night scene or something, that would make sense. But if it's a day scene, usually you'd have darks in the foreground. So to give you a more concrete example of this, if we look at this lower right illustration, the part that's closest to us is this landmass that's kind of jutting out with the tree. And you can see there's 2 characters here, but they're all dark. They're using dark values. There's a few spots where things are glowing, but overall, the set of values used for this tree, for this landmass, and for these characters are darks. Then we go into the midtones for the middle ground, so like all this land and everything. And then towards the background, things get really light. So like the sky and everything is pretty light. And so that helps to create depth. This little sketch on the lower left is also kind of doing something similar with this tree that's in the foreground. And these plants that are in the foreground, they're darker than the rest of the piece. Also similarly with this underwater illustration, there's a landmass that's on the right side of the piece that's darker. It still has some highlights in it, but for the most part, like the mass itself is dark. The one that's further in the distance is a little bit lighter. The ones that are even further in the distance here are even lighter, and then it gets lighter toward the back. Okay, another technique to create depth is to overlap elements. So what this means is rather than having your elements in your piece be side by side, having them actually go in front of each other. So, I mean, I have a very simple example here that's not really that much depth, but I just kind of wanted to show you that this technique can be used even if you're not trying to create depth. Putting a lot of things that overlap on top of each other kind of makes it feel a little bit more lived in. But if we look at this illustration on the right, we've got a tree kind of coming up here. Again, this tree is really dark because it's more in the foreground. I have like a mushroom coming up in front of this tree here. I have these mushrooms kind of coming up in front of these mushrooms. This tree is kind of overlapping in front of this waterfall. I have the character here overlapped in front of the tree, if that makes sense. Okay, framing. This is another trick. I use this trick a lot to create depth. And what framing is when you put like objects that are like partially visible in an illustration that kind of almost create a frame around the art piece. So I think probably the best example is this one here. You know, this character is escaping an underwater shipwreck, and there's like this mass of like coral and rock that's kind of adding a frame here in the upper left of the piece. There's also a rock kind of in the lower left. If we go back to this previous one, this tree that's in the upper left is also kind of creating a frame, as well as these this little land mass here with the mushrooms. You can see here there's a house here with another like building here with the character framing on the right side of this drawing. And then with the crab, you can see that there's a rock formation with some coral kind of coming from the right side of this piece, as well as another set of rocks coming from the lower left, which kind of creates a frame. This one in the upper left, there's some vines coming in from the left, and then there's like some sort of structure here that's holding up some plants that's kind of framing the piece here. So this is a technique I like to use a lot, and I have a simplification of it here. It's just like foliage or rocks or something that you put in the foreground that's kind of dark and creates almost like a frame around your art. You don't necessarily have to have it go all the way around. It definitely will feel different if you have it going all the way around the piece. It'll feel a lot more claustrophobic, which may be a feeling that you want in your piece. It really depends. I have a lot more framing in this particular piece because I did want it to feel kind of claustrophobic. This character is trying to escape the dangerous shipwreck, so it does feel more claustrophobic because of how much it's being framed and how much it's surrounded by dark. Okay, another thing for creating depth is something called atmospheric perspective. And I don't have the greatest examples of this, but what this has to do with is the way air impacts the color and the value of objects. So air is not actually clear. Air has some substance to it. And if you're looking out at a vast landscape, you'll notice that, you know, the mountains that are closer to you are darker than the ones in the distance. The ones in the distance start to get lighter and they tend to get more blue. I wish I had one that was in color for you. But hey Gamerlock, welcome to the stream. Hey Zalfan. Hey Extra, how's it going? Welcome. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. But with atmospheric perspective, objects that are closer to us have the color that they should have. But as they get further away from us, air distorts the color. The air and the moisture in the air changes the way those colors are perceived and makes them end up being lighter and lighter as they're further away from us. And they also become more blue. They have less contrast. So the values become lighter. So using this technique can help to create more depth. You can see that I kind of used it in this illustration here. I've got some clouds that are more in the middle ground of the piece that are orange. But as they go further in the distance, they get cooler. So warms in the foreground and cools in the background. So that's kind of a related technique that you can use. I probably should have put it on a separate slide, but this technique of using warmer colors, so like reds, oranges, yellows in the foreground, and then cooler colors like greens and blues and purples in the background can help to create depth. You can also see some subtle usage of it in this Eventide campaign piece where these buildings that are more closer to us are darker, but the ones that are starting to kind of go more towards the distance are a little bit lighter. And then the mountains in the background get even lighter. But I think it's most obvious in this black and white piece here with the mountains. Okay, we are like halfway through this presentation part, so I have to do the obligatory. Please like and subscribe if you are finding this content useful. Your likes and subscribes really do help us to reach more people, so please do so. Okay, arranging elements. So this is now a set of like really practical compositional tricks that you can use when you are creating your artwork. So I've got a lot of these in here. Some of these I don't actually use, but I've heard of and I will share with you, and other of them I actually use frequently and I actually have examples of. So one of these techniques is called the rule of thirds. So if you take your canvas, and I should have mentioned this in the beginning, but everything I'm talking about here applies both to digital art and traditional art. There's nothing here that is restricted by your medium. So it's all applicable across the board. But if you have questions about that, let me know. Oh, we have a question about framing. Can framing overlap? Duskfire is asking if framing overlap. Yes, you can actually create a lot more depth by doing that. So I think, let's see, why is my thing twitching here? You can see here I've got a piece of coral that's overlapping on top of these rocks, which are also overlapping on more rocks. So yes, you can have multiple like pieces of your framing overlapping on top of other things. I'm kind of also doing it here. I've got this house here and then another building behind it, although I'm kind of trying to make these things feel like one shape by using similar value structures. So if we go back actually to when I was talking about, where was it? I forgot which slide it was. Give me a moment. Planes, here we go, planes. So when we were talking about planes, foregrounds, you group them into darker values. It helps a lot if those framing elements have a very similar tonal structure and almost look like the same shape. Even if there is some distinction, you know, like in the case of this piece here in the lower right, this main foreground element is mostly dark. And a trick you can use is if you squint at a piece, like you just squint your eyes, you can start to see this one big shape of darker tone here. You kind of, squinting is a good way to kind of simplify the tonal structure and composition of the piece. Because it basically prevents you from seeing detail. You just kind of see the big shapes, if that makes sense. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, please clarify. Okay, so rule of thirds is about you take your canvas, you split it into thirds both lengthways and vertically, and you can use this technique two different ways. One is you put your focal points where those lines intersect. So one of these 4 focal points is a good place to put generally where you want the eye to go. It tends to create a pleasing composition. Another way you can use this rule of thirds is by blocking out a large shape that fills a third or 2/3 of the canvas, kind of like the way I have it in this simple sketch here. Like you could have the ocean or something filling 2/3, and you have the horizon line right on this upper third line here with some mountains kind of peeking up. You can see I kind of use this rule of thirds here in this little painting I did. I did this on my cell phone while at Lake Tahoe. And the lake is roughly, the horizon line of the lake is roughly on that upper third of the piece. Another compositional trick you can use is L. Now this is not one I have used much, but it's basically where you have an L-shaped thing that is dominating your composition. So a tree, a mountain, whatever, a dragon, whatnot. Pretty simple. Another is triangle. This one I was actually surprised I had an example in my sketches. You can see that these two characters that are here combining, they're doing a duo cast. This is from one of our art RPG battles that we had done, one of our art RPG battle events we had done a while back. And these two characters are forming a triangle. And that creates a pleasing, a pleasing layout for your drawing. Okay, Strange Snake is asking, how much overlap is too much? Like trying to draw a creepy forest, having everything is too much work and details for your eyes. So that's a good question. Okay, so one of the things that actually helps is to think about those trees almost like one shape, because sometimes actually detail can hurt you if you have too much, and just thinking about it as like a simple dark shape, like all the trees combining together. In fact, maybe I can do a quick demo. Let me switch over to Photoshop real quick. Okay, where's my pen? So, okay, creepy forest. So if we were to sketch this out, let me move my microphone a little bit here. So you'd probably have like multiple trees and branches and stuff. Maybe you'd use some framing here of some trees. Maybe you'd even have like a little hole with an owl or something. And you kind of, it helps actually to think about this as like one tone. So not even like doing much in terms of shading, just like filling it with one tone and maybe some very gentle, gradual lighting, but not much. So not worrying too much about the texture or the detail, especially in the framing elements, because really you just want them to be dark. And then let me change my brush here. Switch to a gray. That's too dark. Too dark. Then these trees that are kind of a little bit, that's still a little too dark. Let me change that. A little lighter. Then these trees that are kind of in a middle ground. You're kind of thinking of them like they're one shape. Even though they're multiple trees, they're kind of combining together in a one shape. Which means you don't have to do much in terms of detail because you're just filling it in mostly one color. Let's fill this all the way in here. And then, after we do that, maybe we have another layer of trees in the back or something. So your concern about there being like too much detail because there's too many elements is a valid one, but you can get around that by combining multiple elements into one shape and thinking about them as one shape, if that makes sense. And you could trust your judgment too. If it looks and feels like it's too much, you can, of course, take out some of that detail. So, in case it isn't clear, you wouldn't take the time to like perfectly shade every tree and show highlights on everything, if that makes sense. And you wouldn't put like detailed textures and stuff. Okay, back to presentation here. Okay, triangle. We just covered triangle. All right, diagonal. So this is another very simple compositional technique. It just means having either a shape. Usually it means having a shape that would fill a large portion of the composition that creates a diagonal through the piece. So this bird I happened to paint recently had a twig that creates this nice diagonal line through the piece. I did this quick little sketch of an example of like a mountain filling out, a diagonal of the piece. And then there's this piece I did here where these two characters are standing on an airship, and this edge of the airship and their position in the airship is kind of creating a diagonal. So that's another trick you can use. S is another common one. Great for landscapes. If you've got a path, a river, a path or something. And this is really nice because it kind of gives the space a lot of depth, makes it feel like you could walk through it, if that makes sense. These are 2 sketches, again, that I did on my phone. They aren't like final pieces or anything. But just like really quick little sketches I did for fun that happened to show this like S technique. So here we can see that we have this bridge here with a little path that's going and creating an S curve here. And then this one of the river itself is kind of creating an S, and then these dark grasses are kind of continuing the S this way. Clustered dangle. I really, really like this compositional trick. I use this one a lot. And what this means, let me hide my head here for a second, because I think it's in the way. So clustered dangle means you group multiple items together. Oops. You group multiple items together, like you see there's like these, I'm using these simplified little circles. You group elements together in the composition, and then you also have pieces that are dangling like vines or something like that in multiple parts of the piece. So you can see in this piece on the right here, I have like a laboratory, right? And I've grouped together all this lab equipment. I've clustered them together here in the center of the piece. And then I also have dangly bits of foliage that are dangling from the top of the piece. I've also got some other pieces dangling and coming in from the bottom here. But I'm grouping things together. So that's what this cluster and dangle is. You don't have to use both together. You can just use the cluster technique. You could just use the dangle technique. But the 2 together can also be very nice. Okay, where's my face? Gotta bring it back. Okay, so another compositional trick is to use variation in the size of your elements. So if we look at this art piece on the right, I've got jellyfish and stars, okay? And I've got them in various sizes. So I've got a really big star here, the star lantern on the right. Oops. Wasn't sure if you could see my cursor, but I've got this. Actually, does this thing let me do a laser pointer? Does this work? Ooh, look at that. Maybe you can see that a little easier. Okay, so there's a star that's pretty large on the right over here. And I have a jellyfish that's pretty large here. And then there's other areas where there's stars, but they're smaller. You know, I'm varying the size of these elements. There's a smaller jellyfish here, if that makes sense. So change vary the sizes of the objects that are in your piece. All right. My screen is totally tripping out on my side. I don't think it likes this laser pointer. How do I turn this off? Okay, there we go. Okay, another compositional trick you can use is called the golden ratio. I don't know that I've ever used this, but I wanted to toss it in here in case it's something that you find useful. So you basically would take one of these 2 golden ratio images you can grab them from Wikipedia, and you put them on your canvas, and then you kind of align elements to one of the lines that's created in the golden ratio. So for example, you could have, if you had buildings or trees or something, you might align them with this line or with one of these lines. You know, there's different lines within here. You could fit elements within these boxes. Something about the golden ratio is considered pleasing to the eye, basically. Or you can follow the curve from the Fibonacci spiral. That is another option, is following the spiral rather than following the proportions of the boxes. I wish I had an example for you, but I have not actually used this technique. But like I said, I thought this was a good one to include. It looks like a pretty easy one to apply. Maybe we can go through it in our demos. Okay, so how do we practice all these things that we're learning about composition? Well, a really easy way to practice and apply this knowledge is to do quick studies, like sketches that are maybe, 5 to 10 minutes each from life. So going out to different places, and sketching landscapes, sketching from life, sketching cityscapes, that kind of thing. It gives you a lot of practice without having to create a finished piece, right? Because you can actually learn and apply all these techniques without having to go all the way to a finished drawing. You can very quickly start to practice these with just really simple sketches. All the ones that are shown up here in the upper right, these are all ones I just did on my phone while hanging out at the golf course with my husband. And they're just, the purpose that I had in doing these sketches was just to practice composition. Like, how do I arrange these elements in a pleasing way on the canvas? Okay, we've got a question from Duskfire about the lab piece. The lab piece you showed, was it using a diagonal along with cluster dangle, or is it tilting another technique? Yeah, definitely this is using diagonals for sure. Like, we've got diagonals for the if we were to draw lines to represent the edges of these, what do they call it? I'm blanking on the name. Brain is not working. These containers, we'll just call them that. They're supposed to be like cryogenic chamber type things. And yes, so diagonals are definitely being used here, and you can see that diagonal in this case is creating a creepy vibe because it's like the whole camera is tilted rather than having the object itself be a diagonal shape, like a mountain or something. Because in the other diagonal example we looked at, that we had like down here, the camera is not tilted, right? This is, the horizon line would be here, down low, and the mountain happens to be shaped, creating a diagonal. But yes, you can use diagonals by tilting the camera as well, and that gives you a different kind of feel. Okay, where were we? Okay. Oh yes. Another way that I strongly recommend that you apply all of this knowledge today is with thumbnailing. So next time you sit down to do your next illustration, do some thumbnailing. Don't commit to a drawing and go straight into drawing the final thing right away. If it is something where you want to have an immersive background, you need to do some time thumbnailing. So doing these quick sketches, like on the bottom here, thinking about the different elements that could be in your composition, using the different techniques like rule of thirds, S, L, etc. And creating planes, foreground, middle ground, background. So thinking about those things in this early stage of the thumbnail process. Okay, it's time for demos. So what I'm going to do is, right now we have an event going on PaperDemon boss fight. So I'm going to do some sketches of my character participating in this boss fight using one of the prompts that we have here. So, where are the prompts? Here we go. Draw or write about your character fighting the boss. So we're going to try drawing my character Gerald fighting the spore boar. And we will use these compositional techniques in the sketches. So I'm going to do thumbnailing. I might spend a little bit more time than what I've told you to spend on thumbnails because I'm going to talk through my process and go a little bit slower. And answer questions and that kind of thing. But let's brainstorm some ideas for this. Okay, let me switch here. All right. And if you have questions, now is a good time to ask them. One of the things I should have wrote down is what all those techniques are so I can demo them all for you. So for sure I want to do the 3 planes. We can do L, we can do S, we can do diagonal, we could do golden ratio. If there's any particular ones you want to see me demo, just put it in the chat. Okay, so our prompt is to draw a character fighting the boss. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to just thumbnail ideas. And I may not actually have much in the way of composition yet. I'm just going to find the ideas. And then from there, we can refine our composition a little bit. We'll see. All right. Okay. So, as I've talked about with thumbnailing, you want to go small, not too big, because you don't want to get into the details. We're going to itty bitty bitty drawings. That's what we want. Okay. It's hard to draw with this big ass microphone in my face. I don't know how other streamers do it. Maybe they're not using a giant Yeti or they have it placed differently. Now I'm remembering why I had my microphone on the other side before. Okay. But since you guys all need to see this, I'm going to zoom in. Zoom in. Okay, so first thought I had, what if the spore boar is here in the foreground? Creating a plane. And my character is kind of in the background. Oops. Press the wrong button. Okay, so already I have a foreground element of the boar here. And then maybe we could, and it's kind of creating a diagonal, actually. I'd probably want to add another plane behind this, with some trees. Maybe even put some mushrooms here in the foreground to frame it. Oh, I love framing. Framing is like my compositional like go-to. I just love to use that technique. Okay, so this is using, I guess, diagonal and planes, and it's using framing. Okay. Okay, we have a question. What really confused me was the golden ratios. I only seen those in math class. Okay, let's demo that one. Let me make a quick stop at Wikipedia to grab these images so I can drop them into my canvas. Where is it? There it is. Okay. One moment. Okay, so I would plop. Oh, what? Oh, I did not like it. Okay, let me take a screenshot. Oh, crap. All right, now that should work. Okay, so what I did is I went to Wikipedia and I just copied the golden ratio graphic into my canvas. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale it a little bit here. And I'd want the actual, I'm going to put this on a separate layer with transparency so we can kind of see it while we sketch. Okay. So how you can use this, there's a few different ways you can use it. We'd want our canvas to actually match the golden ratio. Now, we could do it several ways. So let's do a few examples, okay? We could have, for example, the boar kind of filling up this space here. So we're taking this shape that's from the golden ratio and filling it with something. Now there's multiple, if you look at the golden ratio, there's multiple different rectangles in there that you can use, right? But you could have the boar here, for example, roughly taking up that space. And maybe also combining that with some landmass that it's on that's also kind of forming this other shape that's here. You'd have to still use some other elements to kind of make it a little bit more dynamic. Like I'm thinking that this is looking a little bit boring for a boss fight illustration. But compositionally, the way that these shapes kind of fill up the screen feels nice. The space feels nice. It feels more pleasing to the eye than it would be if you were to, for example, have the boar dead center like this. There's something about these proportions that feels good. Now the other way you can use this golden ratio is, let me find the other image, which is the Fibonacci Spiral. Let me screenshot this. So we put it on a separate layer just so we can see it. Of course, if you're working traditionally, you would probably print it out and then like use a tracing or backlit something so that you could see the spiral or the guides to help you. So here, if you were going to use this spiral, you might like use it to indicate magic or something. Like maybe there's a water spell that my character is casting or something. Maybe I'll draw him over here on the left. He's got his legs like this, or his hands here, his face here, and he's just casting some magic that then follows the arc of the spiral. You don't have to follow these guides exactly, any of them. They're meant to be used as a starting place. I think this feels a little bit strange probably because it's right on the edge. I think if I make it look like the magic is kind of going off the screen, it would probably feel a little bit better compositionally. So maybe not following this line exactly would be better. I'd probably add a little bit more magic here too. Excuse my burps, sorry. Apparently I have the burps today. I'm not sure if it's clear what's going on here, but I have my character here, his hand here, another hand here, foot here, and he's casting water magic. And the water is following the spiral from the Fibonacci spiral. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, we have another question from KM Kala. When it comes to combining focal points and the three planes, would it usually be best to have the focal points in the middle ground? Typically speaking, your focal points would be in the middle ground. That doesn't mean you have to do that. You can certainly have planes where your main focal point is the background, or the main focal point is foreground. And it depends on how you architect your piece. What is the value structure? What lines and shapes you're using to guide the eye. And there's no wrong way to do it. I don't want you to feel like if you're not using these tricks, you're doing it wrong. I don't want you to think that if you diverge from some of these techniques in some way, or that you're doing it wrong, or that you have to follow it exactly to the letter. That's not the intent here. Oftentimes you'll end up using a combination of these techniques together and combine them in ways that work for you. But yeah, I could actually put together an example. I have an example in my head actually of how we could do the foreground is the focal point. So you could have here, I'm using rule of thirds by having the character take up the lower third of the canvas. And he is concentrating on doing his magic. And he is in the foreground for sure. And maybe he's even darkened, right? This is his hair and stuff. And then there might also be a middle ground where there is some foliage, some mushrooms, because we're in the land of fade-in, so there's lots of mushrooms here. In fact, why don't we can use the triangle here. Let's use the triangle technique here too, where the mushrooms kind of form the inverse of a triangle. And that tip of that triangle points right at our focal point, which is our character. So these mushrooms here are the middle ground. The problem with doing thumbnails, demoing thumbnails for you, is that my thumbnails are, of course, very rough. And as they should be. That's how the thumbnailing process goes. And typically with thumbnails, only the artist really understands what the hell's going on in them. Which is makes it hard for me to explain to you what's going on here. And then, okay, so we have these mushrooms in the middle ground, right? And they are creating an inverse triangle. So this is foreground focal point, inverse triangle. And then we haven't added a background yet, so maybe there would be some I think, let me change my brush for this part here. Sorry, I just smacked my microphone. I apologize. So, you know, maybe we'd have some mountains or something that would fill up this far background part. Maybe just to make it a little bit clearer, we'll fill this all in, make it darker. Just to make the tonal structure a little bit stronger, because it looks like now our background and middle ground are a little too similar. So let's make that a little bit clearer. Let's create a very clear tonal structure to this piece. His hands should probably be in there too. Let's just put his hands here. Okay. So now we've got a much clearer tonal structure. We can see a foreground, very clear foreground, middle ground, and background. Where's my brush? So the different planes are, if we were to just draw a line to outline foreground, middle ground, which is creating a triangle, and then the background is all of this here, basically. Does that make sense? Take out those red lines. Maybe put an explosion in the background with the boar flying upwards. Oh, I love it. Oh, that sounds great. Let's do that. Let's do another composition with this idea. We have not done... Let's go back to my presentation really quick and see which ones we haven't done yet. We haven't done S. We have not done L. I don't think I've demoed rule of thirds with the focal point yet. I did rule of thirds where an object takes up a third of the canvas. So maybe we could try that. And maybe try it with S or L. Okay. So let's split our canvas into thirds. this. Okay. So maybe we have the boar flying in the air here and an explosion. I don't think I could do this with S. I don't know. Maybe I can. Hold on. I guess. Oh, I could do it like this. So we have the boar here, these little legs flying in the air. I might even, oh, excuse me. Let's make him a little bit smaller. S is often used for like landscapes when you're creating a path that you want the eye to follow, like as if it was a path you could walk along, but you could totally use it for like magical spells too. I think I could put the hands of my character here casting. Maybe he's off screen, all you really see is his hands. Although that wouldn't fulfill the prompt requirements for the challenge, because you have to show 50% of your character. So this wouldn't quite work. I'd have to alter it. Maybe we make him a little smaller here. Show him from the back. And he's almost like creating a frame. Almost. Kind of, sort of. But he's definitely a foreground element, right? And we might make him dark. I'd say this also follows rule of thirds in that he's kind of taking up this lower square of the 9 boxes. Or we can move his head so that it aligns with the intersection of the thirds. Actually, that does work a lot better. His hair is kind of flying around here. Because there's different ways you can use rule of thirds. You can use rule of thirds by creating a focal point on the intersections. So like in this case, we're doing like this. Or you can do rule of thirds by having an object take up a third of the canvas, or, you know, 2 of those boxes in the canvas, if that makes sense. Duskfire says, that's badass. He looks so cool. Oh, thanks. Okay, so we have an S here. Let's try, let's write down. This is S and rule of thirds. All right, we have not done L yet. L, I think, might be a hard one to really make fit for this type of illustration. I mean, usually with L, you have a more, you have a portrait, and I think L feels calm, if that makes sense. It has kind of low energy. So, and we're doing a prompt that's more about battles, like someone casting a spell and attacking or something. We're trying to do something more dynamic. So if, you know, I think that's kind of the reason why the S works really well because it's got a lot of energy and excitement to it. And likewise, diagonal can work really well, and triangle can work really well because these have a lot of energy to them. Whereas when you have lines that are just kind of perpendicular, straight up and down, left and right, that doesn't really contain a lot of energy. That actually feels more calm. So these are other things. I didn't include this in the presentation, but these are things that you can think about in terms of what feeling do you want your viewer to have when you are constructing your illustration. Do you want it to feel exciting or do you want it to feel calm? Okay, but regardless, let's try an L composition anyway. My brain is thinking straight to trees and foliage for the L. What I might do is, we are in the mushroom forest. So what I might do is like a bunch of these mushrooms clustered together. Let me zoom in here. Clustered together to form an L. I might have like some other foliage kind of framing on the left or whatever, but I might even have some foliage dangling from the edge of these mushrooms. Like vines or something growing on the mushrooms or something, or maybe they're just really, really slimy mushrooms. But you'll see that these shapes kind of, when combined together, are creating an L shape, right? So this would probably be like our middle ground, right? And just to kind of make it a little bit more interesting, I might add like an inverse triangle behind it. Like some mountains or something in the background. So you'd think about these so you don't necessarily have to have one object that creates and forms the L. Okay, we have a question from CPRAN. Will this stream be available on the channel afterwards as a recording or as an edited video? So this link that you accessed will be still accessible afterward and you can reference it. I'm probably going to take this video and edit it down to a shorter one like I did with the last stream. So you will still be able to access this. It may not appear in the main channel listing of videos. I might unlist it, but put it in the playlist of full live streams because my preference is going to be for people to watch the shorter version. But if you keep this link handy, you should still be able to access this afterward. And I can also share the link to the presentation so that if you want to reference the Google presentation to have all of these available to you, I can do that. I'll share that in the Discord. Let me just make a note. So I don't forget. We have another question. A lot of fantasy fan art, example Charizard using flamethrower, I see uses the S style or the golden rule for Fibonacci curve to indicate attacks or depth. Oh yeah. See, now that you know these tricks, you will see them everywhere. In fact, that can be a fun exercise, is look through your art collection if you have like a Pinterest board of art that inspires you or something, and just see if you can spot some of these techniques. You know, if you're not feeling up to drawing, that's another way that you can kind of practice and remember these techniques, is just to see if you could spot them. Okay, so I have a background and a middle ground. I don't have any characters in here yet. So I'm not really sure if this composition works with characters. I think it's just a backdrop. I would think if I was going to use this L technique, maybe it would have been smarter to use it for whatever my focal point is, like the character or something. But I guess I could put like the boar up here if I wanted, like standing on a mushroom, and you know, my character down here. Interacting with it in some way, but I don't really know if that works so well. I think that this kind of illustrates the L concept on its own, but it doesn't actually fulfill our prompt, so that's okay. It's not a big loss. I think I pretty much demoed everything I needed to demo. Were there any other questions, the things that people would like to request that I demo from the slides? I can pull them up again too if that's helpful. Here we go. So we had planes, overlap, framing, atmospheric perspective, rule of thirds, L, triangle, diagonal, S, cluster dangle, size variation, golden ratio. Any other things you'd like me to cover? Or anything that's unclear and you want me to go over again? Happy to clarify. By the way, all of you have really great questions. Thanks for being active in the chat and asking them, because, you know, when you have a question, I know it can be hard to ask because you're not sure if, like, you feel stupid asking a question. But honestly, if you have a question, probably other viewers who are going to watch this recording are going to have the same questions. So I appreciate you taking the time to ask those, because it does help. Not only will it help you and help me to know like how I can make things clearer, but also it helps others who may be watching the stream as well. Looks like there's no more questions. So just a reminder, if you've got art block, check out PaperDemon.com, because we have an art role-playing game to help motivate you to create. You draw your OC, you earn loot, and you defeat art block. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to join. It'll say draw your OC, earn loot, defeat art block. It's free. We do have some paid parts of the game, but you can play the game completely free. And we're here to support your growth as an artist and to help you to become more awesome. Stay tuned. Join our Discord or our newsletter if you want to be notified of our next stream. We do art lessons like this once a month. So the next topic, I think I'm going to cover, I haven't decided yet, but I think I'm going to cover how to create an OC. That was a request that someone made. So I think I'm going to cover that for December. I think that would be a good time to go over it. But if you have requests for art topics you'd like me to cover, do let me know in the Discord, in the suggestion box, or, you know, post in the chat here or as a comment on this YouTube video. Thank you so much for joining me. Next stream is going to be in exactly 4 weeks. Let me double check. Which is going to be December 4th, tentatively December 4th. So mark your calendars. We'll do the same time, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. I will send a notification out on the email newsletter as well as the Discord. So if you're in there, you will get notified of that schedule, or you can click the bell on good old YouTube. I don't know how reliable YouTube's notifications are, but you know. We have one more question. Is there a limit to how many techniques one should combine in one picture? As many as you can get away with. You can... what's funny is that, like, I don't usually think about these techniques when I'm using them. They kind of become second nature, especially the framing technique. I just use it, like, in almost every time. Can you do a demo on atmospheric depth, like the blue mountains getting lighter in the background? Yes. This one's a little bit harder for me to demo because it requires actually using color and painting. I can't do it in a quick sketch, but I will do a quick demo for you. In fact, looking at photographs would actually be really helpful. I want to pull those up, but I'm afraid I will be violating someone's copyright, so that's the only reason why I'm not doing it. Let me switch back to digital here. My Photoshop here. But yes, I can demo that. So if we were using our prompt, I'm going to go a little bit bigger here because I need a little more space to work with to make this work. So let's say we are going to have, let's see, I need to think of something where these characters would exist. Let me see one of the other sketches we have. Maybe I could riff off of one of these. You know what? We could take this one here and we could use atmospheric perspective with this sketch. So why don't we take this sketch and turn that into a thing. I'm just going to duplicate it here. Go big. Go big. Okay. I'm going to refine this a little bit because I think it's not super clear what's going on. Just to make it a little bit clearer. What? Oh shit. I'm sorry. I keep smacking my microphone. Alright, let's refine this sketch and then we can demonstrate a little bit more what's going on with the atmospheric perspective. Quickly gonna draw in his hair because I really like my character's hair and how it just kind of flies everywhere when he's using magic. I think it looks super cool, so I kind of have to do that. Let's see. It's a little big. I know we had a request as well to cover proportions, so at some point I'm going to cover that as well. Some straight lines there. Okay. So there are mushrooms here. We're using overlapping. We're also going to use some variation in sizes. Remember we talked about that as well as a technique you could use. But we're also kind of thinking about these in as a similar shape, one big shape, to create this triangle. Okay, let's fill it in with some more mushrooms, and then maybe a little mushroom. Okay. Same on this side. Maybe we cluster some of them together. Okay. All right, then we have like some mountains here. And then maybe we have some more mountains. And then some more mountains. Mountains are basically one of the best ways to use atmospheric perspective, but you don't have to have mountains to use this. It's just the most obvious with that. Okay. All right. Now let's remove our sketch here, the first sketch, and let's start to color this in. With atmospheric perspective, the things that are closest to us would have the highest saturation. Oh, where's my brush here? So we already talked about our character would be, I'm just going to put him in like a dark purple because that's the color of his clothes. Just to start here, just to block it in. This early stage of the art is always the worst because things look awful when you're doing the underpainting. But it is what it is. It is what it is. I'm not painting on the lines, am I? Shit. Just duplicate this layer real quick. Make our lines a little darker. All right. Mid-ground, these mushrooms would be a mid-tone. And they would we'd probably want to make them warmer. Actually, I should have probably made my character more on the warm spectrum as well, but we don't have to necessarily do that. So, what color? Maybe we'll go with this. Ooh, that doesn't look good. These colors don't go together. I may have to change this. This is why I need a color comp. That is a reference to our last class. but I want to demonstrate the atmospheric perspective, which is usually warm, full saturation in the foreground and cools in the background, as well as things getting progressively lighter. So let's change Gerald here, and maybe we will make him maybe we should go I should have gone with something simpler so that I could explain this better. Because I think that my first gut instincts for these colors is too complicated and isn't working. So maybe I should stick to cools to simplify this a little bit. So maybe we go with, actually, can I just fill this? Yeah, let's go with that. All right. Okay. So we'll stick with mostly cools, but we'll go cooler, more towards the blues, and go lighter for the background. So actually, even that's too dark. Let's go a little lighter. We're gonna basically go with tertiary colors here. Purples. Okay, so this mountain range that's closest to us would be the darkest. And then we'd start to go a little bit more towards the blues and lighter for the next mountain range behind it. And then we'd go even lighter for the one behind that. And then we'd go even lighter. We're almost at white now for the background, the sky. Okay, hopefully this conveys the idea here. I might even go like darker here a little bit. So atmospheric perspective can be used in many different ways. The main aspect of that technique is that as things recede into the distance, they get lighter and cooler in color. So more towards the blues. So this purple that we have for this main foreground for the mushrooms is a warmer purple. It's got some red in it, so it feels a little bit more warm, like a warm tone. We could make this mountain range that's a little bit closer to us a little bit warmer if we wanted, just to emphasize this transition a little bit more from warm to cool. But you'll see that it's darker as well as warmer. And if you go outside, if you have hills nearby, hills or mountains, you can see this, you can observe this effect in real life. All right. Another compositional trick. I didn't actually cover this in the presentation, but in case this is handy for you, you can also use a technique called rim lighting. And let me explain what that is. So I talked about how when you're using planes, it's really helpful for your foreground to be a set of darks, and then your middle ground a set of midtones, and your background a set of lights. We can't really see our character though, like his face is kind of lost, right? So one technique that we can use is rim lighting to create some more contrast and draw attention to him. So we could use, maybe we could use like pink or something, a bright pink if we wanted. Basically where you have light hitting the character from the edge to light him up. That's what rim lighting is. Of course, you'd have to think about what your light source is. Is it coming from below him? Like maybe he's casting a spell and his magic is below him, is culminating below him in some way. Or usually with rim lighting, it's like the light source is behind. So, you know, maybe we have it like kind of almost like Super Saiyan glowing around him or something. That's another way you could do it. But you could also just imagine it below him in some way. So there's different ways that you can use rim lighting. Rim lighting is very dramatic. So if you want to create some drama. It's also very easy to do. You don't have to think as hard about like where the light's coming from. Of his hair or something here too. Okay, that looks cool. Very dramatic. Okay, so what techniques did we use here? Let's review. Let's do a review. Where is my pencil? Pencil. Okay, all right. So this one is using atmospheric perspective. It's using triangle. It's using foreground, middle ground, background. It's using rim lighting. There you go. Hopefully that clears up atmospheric perspective for you. But like I said, I think looking at photographs of landscapes and actually going outside and observing this phenomenon for yourself can be really helpful to understand it. You can also Google atmospheric perspective too. See some other examples. Maybe some other artists will explain it better than I can do.